So I've been set up to share a screen, and I'm going to launch right into this because I want to save a lot of time. I understand we have 40 minutes allocated. I want to just present for 20 and allow 20 minutes for question and answers. And I've asked Dr. Ingram to just go ahead and tell me that there's only 5 minutes of that first part left. So here is my presentation. Okay, and I've given a copy of this to Dr. Ingram, and I'm happy to have you, pass it around and share it, and it's all for you. So first of all, I want to start out with acknowledging with a map that I've made that we are on the land of historic ancient lands of indigenous people, the Chumash, the Tongva in particular, but also their neighbors, the Cahuilla, the Payam-Cowicham, the Serrano, the Catanamuk, the Tatavium, and the Kizh. So this is, I'd like to start with this map because, this is drawn from my work. I've been working on a grand history of Los Angeles since the Pleistocene. And I've been humbled by the antiquity of the culture that had persisted here and still persists for 10,000 years. So one of my goals with my book is to help people to appreciate that we're in a very ancient place that was ruled by remarkable groups of people. So this is a spiral, a time spiral I created to represent such a long time period. And I included here, I think there's a detail here to just give a sense of the depth of the antiquity. The Chumashan people are probably the longest residents of California. They arrived first by sea. The archaeological evidence is that they first settled on the Channel Islands. They were a seafaring people and eventually started to colonize the mainland, settle on the mainland. And their language is considered a basement language. It's not related to any other language. It's so old. And they've been there for so long that the Chumashan languages have now evolved into 5 separate languages that are as different as French and Italian and Spanish. So the evidence is that the Tongva people migrated to the region later, but still have been here for a great many thousands of years. So you'll see on this, way after these thousands of years of occupation, this is when Cabrillo first appeared on the shores, and pathogens had actually started filtering into California from northern New Spain by that point. So I'm going to walk through the 3 names in discussion today: Cabrillo, Danza, and Dana. So just the bare bones here. Cabrillo is somebody that we knew very, very little about, actually. And it was for a long time claimed that he was born in Portugal. And in fact, the Portuguese government donated this monument. They've made a big deal over the years about how he really hails from Portugal. But a detailed research by Harry Kelsey recently determined that he really was born in Spain, and uncovered a great deal of information about him. And this is only since the 1980s that we've really known this detail. The overall significance is that he was a soldier in the conquest of Cuba and of the Valley of Mexico, the Aztec Empire, Guatemala, and Honduras. He rose through the ranks. He was originally a crossbowman, and he built the boats that Cortez used to get across that lake that surrounded their capital in order to conquer the Aztecs. And then he went on to help conquer Honduras and Guatemala. And he was granted, in return for this service, encomiendas. He was an encomendero, which means that this is in the old Roman tradition, actually, to grant soldiers land with the people on them. The people would be their serfs or servants or slaves. In the case of the Spanish at this point, they were enslaved. And he grew very rich on slave labor and gold mines. And by 1530, he was one of the richest men in Guatemala, and he was building ships on the Pacific coast. he was doing that in the service of the governor of Guatemala, Pedro de Alvarado, who wanted to establish a trading fleet across the Pacific. But Alvarado died about the time that this was going to happen. And so the whole fleet was turned over to the Viceroy of New Spain, a very important figure named Antonio de Mendoza, who wanted to reconnoiter the reaches of North America, principally to find if there really were these fabled cities of gold called Cibola. And in the same year, he sent Coronado up north into what is now Kansas. And so the two of them were sent to go find either the cities of gold or a passage to the Atlantic or to get to China. But that was the point of the mission. And so he sailed forth in 1542 and was going, by the way, against the Pacific Current. The Pacific Current is a very important part of our ecology. It flows southward. And so to sail northward is to sail against it and also against the prevailing wind. So it takes a great deal of time to go up that way. He was the first European to see what we now call California. He first touched it down at San Diego, which he called San Diego first, and then San Pedro, which had smog. And so from all the campfires, or not the campfires, but the cooking fires of the indigenous people. And so he called it the Valle de los Fumos, the Bay of Smokes. He went on to find the channel, to visit the Channel Islands. The Chumash people at the Channel Islands came out to greet him. They showed him where to put in at the safe kind of harbors. He went on to try to find these 7 cities, but couldn't make it past the storms by the time he and his 3 ships got to Oregon. So he turned around, came back, and intended to winter on the Channel Islands. And when the Chumash on Santa Rosa Island, which is their most ancient island, Limu is called in Chumash, saw them setting up camp, they realized they were going to stay, and they didn't want that. So they started repelling him, militarily. And in that fight, he fell somehow and was grievously wounded and died, and is actually buried there. The mission was considered a failure. Okay, he didn't find any cities of gold. He died in the process, and in fact, his ship logs were lost. There's very sketchy, actually, information. There's significant, interesting information. He identified Chumash villages, which were huge. By the way, that was the other thing about the Chumash. They had the largest villages of all the native California people. So his life is kind of easy to summarize because we don't know that much. But what we do know is this, that he took an indigenous common law wife in Guatemala and had several children. But then he sought a Spanish wife. So he went and married Beatriz Sanchez de Ortega and brought her back to Guatemala, apparently abandoned this first wife and their children. He actually ordered the kidnapping of women to supply his shipbuilding crews, and in the process of his many gold mines and so on, enslaved whole villages. So I have sources for 2 of these figures. Kelsey is who published this book in 1986, is really still the standard for knowledge. He researched his book in Europe and America, and was widely praised for the quality of his research. And so that's 1542. The Spanish were already had been colonizing New Spain for almost 2 centuries by the time Danza's story starts. He was actually born on the frontier, in the town called Frontera, so give it that name. What was called Nueva Navarra, New Spain, it's now Sonora. This is where the silver mines were, which made Spain very rich, but it was also a brutal place to work. He was the son of a man with the same name, who was also a military officer, and in the period of establishing those mines. But this was a very contested area. The indigenous people resisted constantly. They raided the Spanish settlements. especially the Apache, whose culture was about raiding and trading. Um, so his role there, as he rose through the ranks, he developed a very distinguished military career in the service of the king. He enlisted in the army at the Presidio and was promoted to captain and lieutenant colonel. And these promotions were all because he was successfully fighting the indigenous people all around him. There was constantly a battle. In his petition for another commission, he named how many scores of battles he'd fought in, how many Indians he'd killed. So crucially, he carried out the expulsion of the Jesuits. This is a complicated story, but in the Bourbon reforms of Carlos III, they were threatened by the power of the Jesuits and the way that they had kept their indigenous people on their missions and not integrated into Spanish society. So in a really forceful move, the king sent his principal soldiers out to round up the Jesuits and just send them out of the country and replace them with what they thought was going to be less worldly friars, the Franciscans. So by doing that, he proved his loyalty because he actually was quite close to the Jesuits that he expelled from his own region, and had this, this steady rise in his status and power. Now, he and his father had long dreamed of establishing a land route to California, to the Pacific coast, to cement this whole northern part of Spain. And at this point, the Spanish crown was quite threatened by Russia, which was coming down the coast trapping fur, and also by Great Britain, and really wanted to try to establish a stronger frontier. So that's why they sent the so-called Sacred Expedition of 1769 with Gaspar de Portola and Junípero Serra, who is now a saint, to establish missions, and we know that story pretty well. And so the Anza phase of that story was just a few years later, trying to connect this new established region. And so he had these two successful expeditions, which demonstrated the viability of this land route, and also carried, in his second version, he carried hundreds of not carried, but he transported hundreds of settlers to California. So he was considered unlike Cabrillo, these were really successful expeditions. This is just a map showing where Fronteras is, where he was born, and the region that he was based was right in here, and it's surrounded by indigenous people. The Seris, in particular, were very hostile to the Spanish, and there were numerous campaigns against them, against the Apaches, who were had a raiding culture. So we were always, constantly after the Spanish towns. Also up here are and to the right, and they're not shown in this map, are the Comanche. The Comanche had a huge empire, which was really promoted by the settlement of the Spanish and the Europeans. They like the Apaches, figured out that they could both trade with and raid these settlements, and expanded a great empire, which is now recognized as the Comanche Empire. This whole area was called Apacheria or Comancheria. So Anza was chosen because he was successful at this kind of, this frontier strengthening process. Interestingly, when he was, I think, really interestingly, when he departed, he took with him a guide, an indigenous man who had been at the San Gabriel Mission, which had been established in 1771, and had come down to Tubac, where Anza was based, and so he knew the trail, and so that was. But indigenous people had been using these roads for thousands of years. The Chumash minted the money, the shell bead money, on the islands that people used all the way to the Hopi pueblos. So they knew these routes quite well. In fact, they knew about the movements of the Spanish thousands of miles away. So the crucial thing about this, and I think I got this in the slide here, so maybe it's this map here, is the Yuma crossing. Okay, what they figured out. Let me try to slide. when California was settled for this, in this colonizing process, there were scores of missions and settlements already in northern Mexico and up and down the Baja Peninsula. The problem was, if you wanted to get to California from over here, you had to go across the Colorado River. And so the Yuma, the Quechan, had established a very powerful civilization on the lower Colorado, which was very rich soils. And so they actually farmed corn, unlike the Northern California people. And they were fierce in their protection of this, and it was a crucial crossing. So what Anza knew he needed to do was make friends with the Quechan, and he did. He not only befriended their chief, whose Spanish name was Salvador Palma, but persuaded him to go to Mexico City to become baptized, and regaled him with these fancy uniforms and gifts and so on. And Palma had his own strategic reasons for doing this. He was going to establish a trading relationship with the Spanish and consolidate his power. So then so he came back from that expedition a big hero, but then that meant that he had to do the next part, which is to transport hundreds of colonists, and that was successful too. So on the basis of that, then he was made governor of New Mexico, which was where all this fighting was going on, and constantly went to battle. But his particular challenge was the Comanche, who would form agreements with the Spanish, but then intentionally break them because they had this military culture and they wanted to provoke war. So he figured out that you had to, fight, you had to do the same thing. So he went after their most esteemed leader, Cuerno Verde, which, because he wore this green horn on his headdress, called Tavibo Naritgant in, I don't know how to pronounce Comanche, which translates to dangerous man. And he killed this leader. Then he negotiated with the Comanche. So his policy was actually peace, not peach. That's pretty funny. His policy was moderate. He had, in all this time he'd spent on the frontier, he developed the idea, the belief that the Spanish needed to, form treaties and trade relationships and try to buy their way into friendship rather than constantly fighting. But he was quite a warrior, but he was considered moderate by his own time. Yes,
we're about 15 minutes in.
Okay, about how many minutes in?
About 15.
15. Okay, great. Thanks. However, Anza's major achievement in making peace with the Quechan did not last long. The Quechan failed to see any trade benefits, and instead they saw the Spanish coming over with herds of cattle and so on, and they were tromping on their fields. So they had it, and as one expedition was coming by to settle Los Angeles, the town of the Pueblo, they fell on them and massacred 131 settlers, priests, and soldiers, and they closed the Colorado for 50 years. So in a sense, even this one thing that Anza was, had achieved, opening this one land route, was a failure because the indigenous people rejected it. Our third figure is Richard Henry Dana. He's also the son of a powerful senior who was a literary critic, the editor of the North American Review. He even attended a school headed by Ralph Waldo Emerson, son of a wealthy, prominent Boston family. He was in Harvard College, but he dropped out because of some eyesight problem following measles, and he signed on as a common sailor on the brig Pilgrim in 1834. So what he'd done was he signed on to a merchant vessel that was plying this trade to trade New England goods for the raw materials for which were primarily leather, big cattle hides, which were produced by the thousands, tens of thousands on the missions and the Mexican ranchos. He worked on the shores of Santa Barbara and San Diego and San Pedro, processing these hides and stacking them and carrying them out to the ships. And he detailed all this in this memoir that was published the same year he was admitted to so he came back and then entered law school at Harvard, and then he published this memoir. And the memoir was a runaway bestseller. It was mainly about the conditions at sea, these harrowing stories of what it's like to be a seaman, but it also has these descriptions of California life. He also then he specialized in maritime law. He wrote the first treatise on the rights of sailors in 1841. In the 1840s and 50s, he was a prominent abolitionist, and he helped organize the Free Soil Party. He even served a very important role during the Lincoln administration in arguing the crucial cases, the prize cases before the Supreme Court. So I'm going to go a little bit over because I need to go through this one part. So the book has been widely credited with promoting interest in California. He has these lovely descriptions of California, the landscape, and rich and fertile. But along the way, he's very critical in his observations of the Mexican leadership of California, whom he thought were lazy. And so there's this famous phrase that's repeated many times: in the hands of an enterprising people, what a country this might be. So the crucial chapter is 21, one of that in chapter 13. The rest of that quote is quite interesting. This whole paragraph, I won't read it out loud here for the interest of time, but what he says is, it's not clear how long this would remain a marvelous country, because he believes that that the Americans and the Englishmen who were filling up the towns were becoming Mexican, and then they were then becoming lazier. Okay, so this is his view of the Mexicans. A typical sentence here is that he disparages a Mexican general, for not being brave. And he says, a dozen Yankees and Englishmen would be a match for a whole regiment of hungry, drawling, lazy half-breeds. That's how he portrays the Mexican soldiers. And in his description of the California, he calls them the Californians, which is right. They call themselves the Californios. They're an idle, thriftless people and make nothing for themselves. He describes their social status relations, which were quite racial. That they ranged from regular shades growing more and dark and muddy until you come to the pure Indian. So these are the questionable parts of the of the Dana book. So back to this, I just have a couple of slides. So just a few questions. Why commemorate? Cabrillo has been commemorated as the first to European to discover or see California, but the Chumash had discovered it 10,000 years earlier. So I'm not sure about that first. Anza is credited with opening the land route, bringing civilization and Christianity. Sorry, there's a typo there. But he only followed indigenous roads, and they were already civilized, and they already had their own religion. Dana is credited with spurring interest in American interest in California. But his narrative is really mostly about a life as a sailor, and that's really how it was mostly received. But he does go out of his way to disparage the Mexicans, and in that way help to justify the American conquest. So the question is, what are we commemorating with them? And these paragraphs go into that a bit. I still want to save plenty of time, but I want to say, at the first half of this century, of the 20th century, these histories, the commemoration was written by the conquerors. So they wanted to, since the Americans were the last in the line of the conquerors, they were the Spanish, the Mexicans, and the U.S., they wanted to justify what they'd done. And these are the precursors of their bringing Western culture to California. But this is also something that Gene O'Brien calls firsting and lasting, trying to name the conquerors as the first somehow, kind of resetting the clock so that the actual people who really owned the land are erased. And also lasting, the myth that there are no more Indians, the vanishing race, which is quite wrong, because there are thousands of indigenous people in California still, and Chumash and Tongva, and they've never gone away. So so we also asked, so what is being commemorated and why these people represent that? And then I thought it'd be useful to distinguish that from whom we are commemorating. Cabrillo's past deeds are really probably the least defensible. Danza made possible so each one of these individuals has his own pluses and minuses. He made possible the settlement of hundreds of thousands of settlers of California, and many thousands of Californians today are descendants of those settlers that Danza brought to California. And Dana spent most of his career fighting against slavery and for the rights of sailors. He played a very minor but supporting role in the conquest of California, but his words in his most famous book disparage an ethnic group who make up a major portion of Los Angeles. So that ends my presentation. I don't have as many words, many minutes for Q&A, but I hope we can get some started. So
Thank you. So feel free, you're able to unmute yourselves, or you can type a question in the chat if you'd like us to read it for you. But we have plenty of time for discussion and questions.
I'm happy to entertain all kinds of questions. But not all at once.
I found the discussion, and I don't know exactly why, but I found it extremely unsettling. It was a very nice talk about three men who you could balance on the edge of a razor. They were either very good or maybe they were very bad, but they walked straight down the middle of the road, and they weren't really either. And that, to me, that's really disturbing. There's no mention of they're conquistadors, first of all. I can't imagine anybody wanted them here when they showed up. And I would be very interested in hearing somebody with an indigenous history go over the same history that I just heard, because I don't think it would be the same. I think it would speak of colonialism and genocide and I don't know. It was a very odd. I mean,
okay, sorry. Well, I thought I was saying exactly that. That Cabrillo was a conquistador. He was the fighter and who slayed and enslaved the indigenous people of Mexico, from the Aztec Empire through Guatemala. Danza did the same thing on a longer scale, wrenching the land from the indigenous people in the northern frontier of New Spain. His actions outraged the Quechan people. I thought I said all that. I started with the indigenous perspective, something I care deeply about. I'm not myself indigenous, but I felt that I was telling the story from the ground up.
I think I missed the first 7 or 8 minutes, so I may very well have missed that. And
oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. So that might be it. Yeah, it's in the slide presentation, and you can.
Oh, okay.
And yeah.
I have a message. I'll read. In that day and age, would we consider any of the leaders stand-up citizens we'd want to name a school after?
In that day and age, there weren't schools the way we know them today, for one thing. In Dana's age, they were getting closer to what we know today. So maybe could we say in this day and age? I think that, the question to me is, this opportunity to name or rename anything is very rare. It doesn't usually come up even in a generation. The names that people chose for schools in the first part of the century reflected the conquering ideology, to commemorate those who had, brought this civilization to California, but in disregard of the civilization that was already there. Enslavement and genocide don't fit with the values of the 21st century. And two of those figures were deeply involved in that. I know you've already taken Governor Peter Burnett's name off of the school. He was the most egregious of all of the in California. But I think the answer to that is, in this day and age, we don't pick people like this. I think Dana is the more complicated character compared to Burnett, certainly, who was pro-slavery. Dana was an abolitionist. Dana, in his book, is actually very sympathetic to the Hawaiians. I didn't go into that. Befriended them. They worked widely as sailors and in that same trade on the California coast. So he can be seen as somebody, with humane values. But his disparagement of the Mexicans is hard to excuse today, and is something to really pause about. He was also unkind to the Indians as well.
Hello?
Yes, hi.
Hi. I was reading on Wikipedia that also, I'm just assuming that he also was against hostile Comanche. And he was helping more of the Apache. So didn't he do somewhat of good there?
You're talking about Danza, I assume.
Yes, Anza, yes.
Well, the way the Comanche Empire worked wasn't highly centralized. So it's, playing one group off of another isn't necessarily, a friendly act. Same thing with the Apache. I think his principal concern was to try to stabilize that border so that the settlements weren't terrorized so frequently, which they really were.
But did he not help them though? Did he not help the Apache at one point? Did he not help that side, or?
Well, it would be more like in the realm of alliances and supporting an ally. It was a highly militarized zone, so it would be like just sort of incessant warfare. And a weekly game, really, of trying to secure allies against other hostiles. So, and this never stopped. I mean, the Mexicans couldn't control that region either, and the United States had to finally send in generals to put down to the Apaches, that is, to defeat them militarily, and that was Geronimo. So I don't think it's easy to sort of redeem Danza because he made alliances with some indigenous groups against others. In his context is to defeat all these people, to turn them into Spaniards, to eliminate their religion and replace it with Christianity. So that's the larger effort, and he played a very large role in that.
Sounds like nowadays.
Sounds like nowadays.
Never mind. That's just under my breath. That was a political thing in my mind. Next person.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really, really interesting. One thing I know it's discussed in some of our breakout groups, it just seems like much of what you said just underscores the fallibility and complexity of human beings inherently. And I think because we're given this unique opportunity to rename, I know I'm concerned as a member of the community that any of the criteria that might be utilized today is going to be something that, in 20, 30, 40, 50 years might be criticized or people be concerned about, or little bits of history are going to come out about certain individuals that will put us back in the same position of questioning, if they're the appropriate person to name our schools for. So I'm just curious, with your background, what your input would be on that.
It's a great question and a great concern. I think the context is that we're undergoing two giant things that have been going on in the last several centuries. One is empire and colonization. And we're only now coming to terms with the cost of that the human cost, the terrible genocide campaigns, for instance, California under the US regime commissioned. And the toll on human culture is incalculable. So we now need all the information, the knowledge we can about the ecology and the environment. And the Spanish managed to eliminate a great deal of that by suppressing the cultures that knew how to manage these landscapes and so on. So the cost has been enormous. And because we're coming to a reconciliation with the cost of colonization, we've been in a period of decolonization really since the 1960s, with the liberation of the African states from their colonial rule. And it takes a long time. And we're coming to terms with the deep, deep history of enslavement and the ideologies that got ingrained and socialized into white people's minds for centuries. And, so really in the big picture, it takes centuries to undo all that. And we're well into that, but we're not done. So I would say that what we're shooting for now is trying to establish a new long-term humanity, a humane, a public ethics that don't, valorize or reward conquest and genocide and justify it through some kind of idea of inferior and superior civilizations. I think the society of the future is one that is based on, that we can all see that the world needs a tolerant and inclusive societies and cultures. And so it furthers that goal to decolonize our own minds, to decolonize our own society. And recognize in frank ways that these people that have been, whose names are on things, are there because they represent the conquest, what we're trying to undo. To find new names that serve purposes going forward that are not laden with their own problems, I think you go to that same question. It's like, what in general is being commemorated with a new name? It could be a movement or ideology or a people. A school could be named after the indigenous people who lived on that land, and so it doesn't pick a particular person, but also people. So if you choose a name, then it is really incumbent on us to research the person's background. And I was actually on a committee of renaming a major building here on campus, which is going to be announced soon. And we did exactly that. We didn't want to make a mistake of not knowing something about the person we were choosing. So, but that's my general response to that, is that this isn't an ephemeral thing, really. I don't think people are going to keep renaming schools every 10 years. I think the goal would be to find something that's really durable and that speaks inclusivity, that people won't be objecting to generations from now.
I do have a comment from one of our participants. He states, I think that all the names should be changed. Do you agree?
All three?
Hmm?
If I were on your committee, I would argue that for that. That's probably where I would come down.
Do you have the criteria that you used or that the committee to rename your schools? Do you have that criteria that you could maybe share with us? Or is it too much?
Yeah, yes, no, it was publicly distributed. We wanted an alum was the ideal. We wanted somebody who was not still living. We wanted their record to be finished, for one thing. So we could, we have the Aung San Suu Kyi problem that, somebody who won the Nobel Prize wound up not looking so worthy of it. So later on. and who would inspire the students. It was and the whole community, the whole Trojan community, who had achieved great things and would serve as an inspiration for us and would reflect the Trojan values. That is what we call Trojan values. So yeah, so we had a set of values that we wanted the person to represent. And those are, we have this list of Trojan values, but integrity and courage and compassion and all these things. So I think that's that's just what we did. That's to answer your question.
Real quick, I'm sure the person you chose is absolutely 100% worthy of the namesake and what have you, but you still run the risk down the road that more information will come out about that person and their history wasn't as clean as you would hope, right? So I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate on that, and I'm curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I just think it's called due diligence. I think you really have to be sure that you really research the person thoroughly. If it's a person, it doesn't have to be a person always.
I have a question. It's just because I've been asked multiple times. First of all, thank you for the presentation. It was very informative.
Sure.
But the question that I've been posed multiple times is, could we drop the entire name and keep part of it? For example, rather than being Richard Henry, or just call it Dana, just call it Cabrillo, just call it Danza. And what's your thought on that?
I don't know. It just seems like a halfway solution, or not entirely straightforward. In fact, Anza. So Anza's name is on the Anza Borrego Desert, for instance, just as Anza Borrego. And Cabrillo's name's everywhere, just as Cabrillo. But it would be hard to escape the fact that it really means Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo of that history. So one of the things I've found actually in California history, I've been teaching California history since the 80s. At San Francisco State, I started teaching it. And most of the textbooks would just start with these Spanish explorers as though their lives begin when they appear in California, as though that's all we need to know about, is they were here in California. What's important is you go back and look at what they did before they got here. What was their role? And so that's what, is behind the name Cabrillo now. Until Kelsey's book, very little of this was known, actually. So it was possible to just sort of celebrate him as the first European to set, foot here. So I don't think that would really satisfy the goals if you're going to go to the trouble of renaming the schools because these people's pasts are problematic, or the role they played, actually. I mean, there were far worse, Americans, conquering California than Dana, for sure. But his attitudes reflected a kind of the way that the Americans saw the Mexicans that they were overthrowing and justifying their doing so. So it's kind of an ironic case.
One more question. There's a lot of different places for Juan Danza, the barista he's got out there.
Mm-hmm.
Will this influence if we change that? Will it go down the line as far as I don't know if it's a mission or there's something out there.
Oh, there's many. Yeah.
No, there's many of what he has out there.
High schools and so on.
Yeah, well, that's changing everything. I mean,
I think it's a really great teaching moment when schools, our university is a school too, and other institutions start, go through this process. It will be newsworthy and will raise awareness of what Danza really was and represented.
mm-hmm.
So I think I don't think it's not going to lead to an immediate renaming of everything. I think many communities will go through this as we go forward. So we had, we took a name off. The committee I was on was what name to put back on, but we took von Kleinschmidt's name off because he was a big advocate of eugenics, and was a big admirer and supporter of the Nazi regime. So that didn't reflect Trojan values, and it spoke to people uninclusively, as they came to campus or enrolled here.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that, a lot of people don't take the time to learn what Danza was. It's just the name of a school. They may identify with the school because of that name, and that's as far as they get with it. but the renaming process helps to people to learn what I think is the most important thing is the deep indigenous history of our region, and what we owe to that culture that cultivated this land and made it the magnificent landscape that the Europeans then stole from them. And it, it speaks to inclusivity. It seems, so I think it's a good process for public education.
I have a couple of comments here. What led your committee to choose a person's name rather than give up on a human name altogether?
Well, because we had a spectacular name to choose, actually. We considered non-human names or something like that, but we had some really great candidates, and one in particular that we really loved, and just seemed to hit all the marks and to be really for the ages. That was a phrase that our committee chair used, and I think it's true, something for the ages. And that's not impossible to find today.
I have a question, another question.
Sure.
It's okay. If it's named after a person's name that's, I don't want to say within the vicinity, but I'm just saying a person's name, do they have to go through like saying, I don't want this to be done, or you have to be able to talk to them, or how's the process of that happening? Like if you want to name it after another principal or something like that.
Well, I don't, if it's a living person, I think that's a real hot topic. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I wouldn't necessarily recommend naming a school after a living person.
Mhm.
Because you would have those complications. And like we're all saying, we don't know what's going to happen with this person in the future. It's not done yet. I think it's really crucial that you really understand their life and ethics, and it's better that they've
So, but I'm just saying, if you did, or if we did,
Mhm.
they would still have to say, okay.
I
mean,
think they would. I
They
think they
would
would.
have
But
to, right? Okay,
yeah,
that's
I would
what
think you
my way.
need their consent. Sure.
Okay.
I have one to read here. Do these schools have to be named after people? If we do decide to make a change, couldn't it be not to commemorate an actual person? Couldn't that be a safer choice?
Yes, I think that's a very viable possibility. And I don't see anything wrong with it, really. It just if you can find something that really, is it kind of an inspiring or highly meaningful name for a school, I don't see any reason why not.
I'll just add to that, yes, so far our conversation has been focused on people because we're trying to decide if the namesakes align with our district values. But yes, like if we continue with this renaming process and consider names for schools, then we absolutely would talk about what type of name and if it's going to be a person or not a person. And so we definitely would explore that through our process.
So is your process similar to what ours was? The first committee decides whether to take the name off, and then another process is to now decide who to or what to name.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So we're talking about that here, and then we'll extend that to our community and get their perceptions, and then present that information and data to our board, who will make the decision about whether or not the remaining 3 schools will be renamed.
Mhm.
I do have 2 short ones left here. Even though they may not have been model citizens by today's standards, by living here, are we not benefiting from their explorations, expansions, and risks?
That's an interesting question. I think that many families who descended from those settlers that Danza brought to California, for instance, are owe their multi-generational lives and families in California to that settlement. It's a question that probably all United States Americans have to come to terms with, because it's a settler nation. The whole place was conquered from those who held this land. And so in that sense, yes. But in another sense, we also owe to them their conquest ideologies and their racial ideologies that were intolerant. I mean, we're still carrying that burden. We carry that burden probably most of all, and that's what how I'd probably answer that whole process. It took centuries and produced this civilization. Is one that was mostly intolerant and based on the idea of white supremacy here in California, in particular, until really about the time of the Second World War, when things started to turn around after the internment of the Japanese. But that racial brutality that characterizes America until about that time, until the middle of the 20th century, is the direct product of those earlier conquest actions by those.
We
natives.
lost the sound.
Lost my sound?
No, I could hear you clearly.
Okay, good. Okay, so that's my kind of complicated, but not too complicated answer to that question. I also note that it's 6:26. So I know you have more to your agenda tonight. Is this
Yeah.
about?
I'm so glad that everyone is so engaged. I think, Wendy, we have a couple more comments, and then maybe after those two, then we will wrap up. And any remaining questions you can share in your breakout rooms or share with me, and we'll make sure to try and get those questions answered.
Okay. The last two, the first one, how do you feel about donor names, naming after a person that donates to the district?
I am not a big fan of that because it essentially means that you can buy your name on a building and then commemorate yourself, essentially. There's a philosophy of charity and giving that's common in different cultures, that the most sincere gift is one that's anonymous, because you don't use it to promote your own social status. I think it's much better for a community to come together and select someone who didn't have any choice, any chance to promote their own name for posterity.
Okay. There's still more coming in, so I am going to choose this last one here. One of our participants would like to thank you for the presentation. Renaming our schools is a huge undertaking. It is my hope that we agree to go forward with the renaming process and reflect our Wiseburn community values of tolerance, respect, inclusivity, integrity, kindness, and overall equity.
I love that. Sounds fantastic.
7 good names for a school.
Yeah, those are values, and you could name it after a value. So that sounds like a great place to wind this part up. And I want to just thank everybody for having me and the opportunity to talk about these important issues.